Every single day, we are absolutely swimming in just an overwhelming sea of information. Think about it, right? News headlines flash by, social media feeds just scroll endlessly, and we're constantly bombarded with expert opinions, takes, hot takes.
Oh, constantly. It's almost too much to process sometimes.
Exactly. And we absorb it all, believing that by consuming these sources, we're somehow, understanding the world. But what if the very structures that decide what can be said, what gets heard, and maybe more importantly, what gets silenced? What if those structures are themselves hidden from view?
Like the rules of the game are invisible.
Yeah, precisely. What if the way we talk, right, even the way we think, is governed by these unseen rules?
That's a powerful thought.
Well, today we're embarking on a truly fascinating deep dive. We're looking into one of the most profound thinkers of the 20th century, Michel Foucault. Specifically, we're going to try and unravel his complex, but I think incredibly insightful concept of the order of discourse.
A big one, yeah.
It really is. And this isn't just about, what's said, the words coming out of our mouths, but about the invisible rules governing how things are said, who gets the authority to say them, and what even counts as truth at any given time.
So it's the framework behind the conversation.
Exactly. Our mission today is to really get our heads around Foucault's core idea of discourse, not just as language, but as this deep, systemic interplay of knowledge and power that fundamentally shapes our reality.
Knowledge and power, always linked for Foucault.
Always. We'll trace how this understanding of discourse has shifted historically, across different eras, showing how radically different civilizations understood truth itself. And then, crucially, we'll bring it home with some surprising, everyday examples that reveal these powerful, often hidden rules in action all around us.
Things we might see every day, but not recognize in this way.
Hopefully. We'll be pulling from a rich collection of Foucault's own key works: Discipline and Punish, Language, Countermemory, Practice, Madness and Civilization, the History of Sexuality volumes, plus his lectures too. Lots to draw on.
A significant body of work, definitely.
Okay, let's unpack this. Foucault's work, I admit, it can seem daunting. It really can.
Yeah.
But for me, diving into his work is like finally getting the secret decoder ring to understand why things are the way they are.
That's a great way to put it.
Once you see these invisible forces, these structures at play, you really can't unsee them. And that's kind of what we're hoping to do for you today, give you that lens.
Indeed. And what's so captivating here, I think, is that Foucault isn't just offering some abstract theory for academics. He's challenging all of us, really, to think critically about the very foundations of our knowledge, our societal structures.
Right. Questioning the bedrock.
Exactly. And this raises a really important question right from the start. If truth itself isn't this timeless, objective thing out there waiting to be found, but is actually shaped by these historically specific orders of discourse, well, how does that change our whole pursuit of understanding?
That's huge. It reframes everything.
It really does. It pushes us to question whether what we perceive as, objective fact is actually a product of specific historical and cultural conditions, and maybe even sometimes a tool of power.
That's a profound challenge, absolutely, and one we'll definitely keep circling back to. So to really grasp Foucault's vision of discourse, we kind of have to start by moving beyond its common everyday usage.
Yeah, the way most people use the word.
Right. When most of us hear discourse, we probably think of it as just conversation, maybe a debate, a discussion, a piece of communication. Like political discourse just means how politicians talk.
Simple communication.
Simple communication. But Foucault takes that everyday idea and just explodes it. He turns it into something far, far more powerful. So how does his discourse go beyond just words to actually shape our reality?
Well, that's the absolute core distinction we need to make right up front. For Foucault, discourse is not merely words or text on a page. It's a much more expansive and influential concept. Think of it as a system of thought, a whole body of knowledge, and a set of practices, actual things people do that collectively produce meaning and actively construct reality within a given historical period.
Construct reality. That's the key phrase.
It is. Think of it almost like the underlying operating system for how knowledge is created and circulated in a society. It functions as this powerful organizing force. It defines what can be said, importantly, who gets the authority to say it, and what statements are deemed legitimate or even true at a specific moment in time.
So it sets the boundaries of thought, almost.
In a way, yes. It's the very framework that makes certain ideas thinkable and expressible while simultaneously rendering others, well, unthinkable or unspeakable or just dismissed as nonsense. So when Foucault talks about discourse, he's really talking about those invisible rules that govern what counts as legitimate knowledge in a particular era.
Okay. And this leads us straight into Foucault's unique method, doesn't it? Which he talks about in works like The Order of Discourse and The Archaeology of Knowledge. He's not just looking at the history of ideas like, oh, Plato said this, then Aristotle said that. It's different.
Much different. He calls it an archaeology.
Right, in archaeology, like he's digging through layers of sediment, excavating these historical epistemological spaces. What does he mean by that? Essentially, is he asking, what were the unspoken rules, the hidden mental models that made certain types of knowledge even possible in a given era? What were the rules of the game for thinking back then?
Precisely. His method is all about uncovering the fundamental conditions, the bedrock conditions, under which knowledge is produced and organized in a particular era. It's figuring out what had to be true about the way people thought and spoke for a particular field of knowledge, say medicine or economics, to even exist and be considered legitimate.
So the preconditions for knowledge.
Exactly. As he puts it, it's about determining in what conditions language could become the object of a period's knowledge, and between what limits this epistemological domain developed. So it's not just about what people thought or believed back then, but rather what made it possible for those thoughts and beliefs to exist, to be articulated, and crucially, to be recognized as knowledge at all.
Okay, I think I'm getting it. He's identifying these hidden grids, these unspoken rules that organize the entire field of knowledge for a society at a specific point in history.
You could almost think of them like the hidden algorithms that shape our current digital realities, influencing what we see and what we don't. These historical epistemes, as he sometimes calls them, did something similar for entire civilizations.
Okay, so we've got this foundational idea, discourse as a system, and archaeology to uncover its rules. Now, Foucault takes us on this incredible journey through time, showing how these unseen rules, these epistemes, completely shift how entire civilizations perceive reality. It's like the world changes its operating system every few centuries.
That's a very good analogy.
So let's start with the Renaissance. You mentioned this earlier. Imagine a time when the world was seen as almost like a book, just full of hidden meanings and resemblances.
That's a wonderful way to capture it. In the Renaissance, knowledge was primarily based on what Foucault calls similitude or resemblance. The whole world was perceived as this vast, interconnected web where everything mirrored something else.
Like echoes everywhere.
Exactly. The stars might mirror human fate. Certain plants resembled the body parts. They could cure the doctrine of signatures, you know. Words themselves were thought to echo the very essence of the things they described. Signs weren't arbitrary. They were seen as naturally linked to what they signified, almost as if the world itself was communicating through this complex system of echoes and reflections.
Wow. So finding meaning was about decoding these natural signs.
Precisely. The theory of the sign back then involved three elements: the marked thing itself, the marking sign, and crucially, resemblance as the natural connector between the two. It wasn't just convention. So the dominant mode of knowing was interpretation, a continuous effort to decipher these hidden correspondences woven into the very fabric of existence. The key insight here is how fundamentally different this order of discourse was from ours. Finding hidden links was the path to understanding.
That sounds like a completely different mental universe. So what happens? How does this world of hidden connections, where meaning is lurking everywhere, get replaced? Things shift quite dramatically, don't they?
They really do. What replaces it is a profound reordering of thought, which Foucault identifies with the classical age, think roughly 17th and 18th centuries. This period basically throws out interpretation as the main guide and embraces order as its central principle of knowledge.
Out with resemblance, in with order.
Pretty much. No longer were things connected by mysterious resemblances. Instead, knowledge became based on identity and difference. The world wasn't a tangled tapestry of hidden meanings anymore, but more like a collection of distinct entities that could be rigorously categorized, compared, laid out on a table almost.
Like sorting everything into boxes.
Exactly. And signs transformed completely. They were no longer seen as natural reflections. They became tools of analysis, marks of identity and difference, principles whereby things can be reduced to order, keys for a taxonomy. That old three-part sign system, marking, resemblance, just disappeared. It was replaced by a strictly binary organization.
Binary, meaning.
Meaning the connection between a sign, like a word, and its content, the idea, was no longer seen as natural. It became a bond established inside knowledge between the idea of one thing and the idea of another. It's a connection made by the human mind, by convention, within a system of classification not found out there in the world.
So we moved from discovering connections to imposing order.
That captures it very well. The core insight here is how deeply our understanding of reality relies on these unseen frameworks we impose on it, frameworks that aren't timeless, but shift radically across eras.
Can you give an example from that classical age? How did this focus on order play out?
Absolutely. Consider natural history in this period. It wasn't focused on, say, evolution or deep biological processes as we think of them. Instead, it meticulously categorized living beings based on visible character, observable traits linked to specific functions within an organic structure.
Like what specifically?
Well, think of a botanist meticulously counting the number of cotyledons, those little seed leaves in a plant, for classification. Why? Because that visible feature played a specific, identifiable role in reproduction. Or think about how the structure of an animal's teeth, are they sharp for tearing meat or flat for grinding plants, indicated its alimentary functions and helped place it in the overall order.
So it's all about visible structure and function fitting into a big chart.
Exactly. This whole ordering of things was driven by a pursuit of a universal science of order, a comprehensive, observable grid to classify everything, from plants and animals to languages and even wealth.
It sounds incredibly ambitious, doesn't it? Like trying to build a perfect, rational map of the entire world.
It really does, almost like, as you said, building Wikipedia before the internet. A grand, orderly system. But history doesn't stand still. What happens in the 19th century to shake up this grand order? Foucault argues that this unified, sovereign space of discourse that defined the classical age actually starts to fracture, to break apart.
Yes, it's another massive shift. It's a kind of seismic event in thought that fundamentally reshapes how we understand not just knowledge, but even our own existence. That grand single table of knowledge starts to splinter.
How does that happen? What does that look like?
Well, language itself becomes fragmented. It sort of detaches from representation as its main job, which was its primary function in the classical age, to clearly represent that pre-existing stable order. Instead, language transitions to what Foucault calls philological objectivity. Philological objectivity.
Sounds technical. It just means language itself becomes a thing to be studied scientifically, almost like a biological specimen under a microscope. Scholars start dissecting it, looking at sounds separate from letters, categorizing different types of sounds, studying how sounds change over time according to laws, much like a biologist studies an organism or a physicist studies motion.
So language stops being a clear window onto the world and becomes an object itself.
Precisely. And this era sees the birth of distinct specialized disciplines. Foucault highlights biology, economics, and philology, each carving out its own specific object of positive knowledge. They're not just entries on one big table anymore. They become separate fields with their own methods, their own truths. The overall takeaway is this move from a unified understanding of the world to a specialized, compartmentalized one, which is much closer to how we operate today, isn't it?
Definitely. We live in an age of experts in specialized fields, and this fragmentation also brings about a new way of understanding time and history, doesn't it? You mentioned history wasn't seen as deeply embedded before.
Exactly. Foucault contrasts the 18th century view, where chronological sequences were basically just a property of that stable order, like lining things up neatly on the table, with the 19th century view. Here, history becomes deeply embedded in the very mode of being of things and men. It's not just a backdrop, it's woven into their essence.
How does that work? How can something become more historical?
Paradoxically, he argues, this shift is illustrated by figures like the economist David Ricardo, with his pessimism about endless economic growth due to factors like land scarcity, and the biologist Georges Cuvier, with his idea of fixism, the belief that species don't change over time. Their theories, by describing a certain stability or decline or limits imposed by the past, actually gave beings a historicity.
Wait, how does fixism create historicity? That sounds contradictory.
It seems so, but Foucault's point is that by defining something against the pressures of time or limits, like Ricardo's limited land or Cuvier's fixed species, you embed it within a historical context. You acknowledge its relationship to time, scarcity, and perhaps extinction or struggle. History was no longer just external events happening to things. It became an inherent part of their existence, their limitations, their potential. This notion of historicity means everything is seen as having a past, an evolution, a trajectory that shapes its current form.
Okay, I think I see that. It's like defining something by its place within a temporal process, even if that process involves stability or limits.
Right.
And this profound shift This fragmentation and historicization even impacted literature.
Absolutely. It almost seems like literature gains a new, somewhat rebellious role in this fragmented world. It turns away from simply trying to describe the external world in that clear, classical way.
How so? What does literature start doing differently?
Foucault emphasizes how literature in the 19th century starts to contest philology. While philology was busy dissecting language into sounds and rules, literature, he suggests, was leading language back towards its naked power of speech, its inherent force. It moves away from the external values that governed it before, like adhering to rules of taste or representing truth clearly. It moves towards what he calls an intransitivity.
Intransitivity, meaning it doesn't point outside itself.
Exactly. Literature begins to affirm its own precipitous existence. It becomes less about reflecting an external reality and more about being its own reality. It becomes, as he poetically puts it, a silent, cautious deposition of the word upon the whiteness of a piece of paper. This radical intransitivity shows how language, particularly in literature, no longer simply represents an external order. Instead, it turns inward. It becomes an object of thought in itself, exploring its own nature, its own limits, its own being, something you see explored intensely by thinkers like Nietzsche and Mallarmé later on.
So language becomes less a tool for showing and more a thing in itself.
Yes, especially literary language. It becomes less about reflecting the world and more about being a world, a self-contained entity with its own truth, its own power.
Okay, so with language and knowledge fracturing, history becoming deeply embedded, it brings us, inevitably it seems, to a core Foucauldian argument. This intricate, often hidden interplay of knowledge and power.
The knowledge-power nexus, it's central.
It really is. Foucault makes this incredibly powerful argument. Knowledge isn't just about innocently discovering truth. It's intricately woven with power. It's like this hidden current shaping everything we understand and how we organize society. It's not just that power uses knowledge. For Foucault, knowledge itself is a form of power, right?
That's precisely it. For Foucault, knowledge production is never neutral. It's never innocent. It's always embedded in and completely inseparable from power relations. And we need to be clear, this isn't power just in the traditional sense of a king issuing commands from on high.
Right, not just the sovereign saying off with their heads.
No. Foucault describes power as ubiquitous, meaning it's everywhere, it's capillary, it flows through everything. It's present in every interaction, every structure, from the smallest social norm, how you're supposed to act in a meeting, to the grandest institution. It's exercised in countless ways through control, surveillance, prohibition, and constraint, even in what he calls the insignificant aspects of hierarchy.
Like how desks are arranged in an office.
Exactly. Or the timetable in a school, or the way a doctor speaks to a patient. While it might be difficult to say who holds power in a precise sense, he notes, it is easy to see who lacks power. This pervasive, networked nature means that knowledge is always already a tool, a mechanism, or an effect of these distributed power relations. It defines what can be known, and by extension, who can know it, who gets to be the expert.
And this pervasive nature of power and knowledge also ties into his critique of some traditional ideas we hold dear, like the Enlightenment's push for critique. We often see critique as this purely rational, liberating force, don't we? But Foucault adds a layer of complexity.
He certainly does. He connects this idea of critique, tracing it back to Kant's Aufklärung, the Enlightenment. He sees critique not just as an intellectual exercise, but as a specific attitude that emerged in the Western world, a particular way of questioning, challenging, asking how not to be governed like that.
Okay, so critique as an attitude. How does power come in?
Well, Foucault argues that this critical attitude is fundamentally linked to what he calls the great process of society's governmentalization. That's a bit of a mouthful, but...
Governmentalization. Yeah, what's that about?
It refers to this profound historical shift in how governing operates. It moves away from the sovereign, the king, the state being the sole centralized source of power. Instead, power relations become far more diffuse, more subtle, embedded in everyday life, reaching into areas previously thought to be outside direct governmental control, like health, family life, personal conduct.
So power gets spread out, becomes less obvious.
Exactly. It makes it much harder to pinpoint who is in power in the traditional sense, because power is now operating through these complex relays and controls across the entire social fabric. It influences behavior often without direct coercion, through shaping norms, expertise, and what counts as rational action. Critique then becomes part of this dynamic, constantly negotiating the limits of government.
Okay, that's a really important nuance. And this takes us to maybe one of the most unsettling but crucial parts of Foucault's work. How these mechanisms of order, these discourses, actively construct what counts as truth, and by extension define who we are as subjects. We tend to think truth is something out there, waiting to be discovered.
Like finding a hidden treasure.
Right. But Foucault turns that completely on its head. It sounds like he's saying truth isn't a mountain we climb to, but maybe more like a building we collectively construct, following certain rules. Is that a fair way to think about it?
I think that's a very helpful analogy. And that building, as you say, requires very specific blueprints. It requires a specific order of discourse to even get off the ground. Consider his concept of apophantic judgment.
Apophantic, okay. Break that down.
Think of it like this. For any statement, say, the sky is blue, to even be considered true or false in a formal logical sense, it first has to be kind of stripped down. It has to be neutralized from all the emotional baggage or subjective context around it and placed within a specific framework where it can be judged according to rules.
So it has to fit this system first.
Exactly. Only then can it be measured against reality within that specific system of thought. Foucault points to historical examples. Take the judge's oath in ancient Greece. He argues it wasn't just a simple formality, like promising to be fair. It represented a whole new arrangement of judicial discourse and practice. By superimposing a third, decisive assertion of truth, the judge's sworn statement, which carried immense weight onto the competing claims of the two litigants, the discourse itself was organized to produce a verdict. It created a truth through a specific procedure, a specific way of speaking and deciding, where truth didn't necessarily exist in that form before the process.
So the legal system created the truth of the verdict through its own rules.
In a sense, yes. It structured how truth could emerge in that context. And what's perhaps even more unsettling is Foucault's idea, heavily influenced by Nietzsche, that our very desire for knowledge, our will to know, might be less innocent, less about pure objective discovery than we tend to think.
What does he mean? I mean, who doesn't want to learn to know things? It seems like a good thing. But Foucault seems to hint there's a cost, or maybe a darker side.
Indeed. Foucault interprets Nietzsche's view that this will to knowledge isn't some benign, pure pursuit of universal truth or gentle mastery over nature. Instead, Nietzsche often describes it as potentially malicious, something that actively multiplies risks, creates dangers, and can even lead to the sacrifice of the subject of knowledge.
Sacrifice of the subject, what does that mean?
It means that the pursuit of knowledge, in this light, isn't just about gaining insight. It can be an apparatus of abstraction and simplification, organized not for knowledge itself, but for mastery over things. This mastery could be over the natural world, sure, but also over other people, or even, crucially, over oneself. It suggests knowledge is deeply intertwined with control and power, and that getting to a certain kind of truth might involve cutting away, simplifying, or even destroying parts of yourself or your previous understanding.
That's quite a challenging idea. Letting go of something fundamental about yourself to gain knowledge.
It is, and this idea of the sacrifice of the subject is something he connects powerfully to the Christian tradition, particularly through the practice of confession of the self. This seems like a very concrete example of how a discursive practice talking about your sins can produce truth by demanding a certain kind of transformation, a certain sacrifice.
How does confession work in this Foucauldian sense?
Foucault analyzes the Christian practice of confession of sins, especially in early monasticism, but also later forms as an institutionalized discursive truth game. This ritualized truth-telling about oneself, often to a spiritual guide or priest, fundamentally requires a sacrifice of the self. The core principle he identifies as stark: no truth about the self without a sacrifice of the self.
You have to give something up to know yourself.
In this framework, yes. To confess fully and achieve absolution or spiritual progress, one must strip away the layers of self-deception, pride, and attachment. One must acknowledge and articulate one's deepest sins, often revealing intimate thoughts, desires, and failings previously kept hidden, even from oneself. This verbalization, this bringing into discourse, is itself a form of sacrifice.
And how does that contrast with later ideas about knowing oneself?
It's a profound contrast, he argues, to the later Western ambition think humanism, psychology, to found the hermeneutics of the self, the interpretation or understanding of oneself on a positive emergence of the self. This later ambition seeks to uncover an inherent, positive, maybe even essential truth within the self. Foucault suggests this quest has led to the permanent anthropologism of Western thought, where the human subject is constantly trying to define and establish a positive, inherent, self-evident truth about itself, rather than seeing truth about the self as something produced through specific, often demanding discursive practices like confession, which involve that element of renunciation or sacrifice.
That's a fascinating contrast, truth through sacrifice versus truth through positive discovery. Can you give us another example of this kind of internal scrutiny, this judgment within a discursive framework where even our thoughts get put on trial?
He uses a really compelling analogy from the early Christian monastic writer John Cassian. Cassian compares the process of scrutinizing one's thoughts, a key practice for monks seeking purity, to a skilled money changer verifying a coin.
A money changer, how does that work?
Well, a good money changer doesn't just glance at a coin.
Wow.
They examine its effigy. Is the image correct? They test its metal content. Is it pure gold or silver or debased? They look for the mark of the workshop it came from. They check its precise weight. It's this rigorous, multifaceted verification process.
Okay, very thorough.
Exactly. In the same way, Foucault suggests, drawing on Cassian's advice to monks, one must verify the quality of one's thoughts. One must ask, do they really bear the effigy of God? Are they pure? Where do they come from God, from the self, or from the devil? What is their weight, their value? This reinforces the idea that even our internal mental processes become subject to a form of judgment and verification, governed by an internal discursive framework, learned rules and categories that dictates what counts as pure or true or acceptable thought.
So it's like applying an internal order of discourse to your own mind, training yourself to monitor and categorize your thoughts according to specific ethical criteria.
Precisely. It's a technology of the self, enacted through discourse.
Okay. With those foundational concepts in mind, discourse structuring knowledge, power intertwined with truth, subjects being formed through these processes, let's turn to some concrete, maybe more everyday examples. How do these discursive orders actually operate in the world around us? These are the aha moments, I think, where you realize Foucault isn't just talking about abstract philosophy from centuries ago.
Exactly. This is where the theory hits the ground.
Let's start with something deeply personal. Our understanding of sexuality. Foucault famously shows how even our most intimate experiences, our very definitions of what sexuality is, are not some timeless natural reality, but are profoundly shaped by specific historical discourses.
This is probably one of his most well-known and challenging analyses. He begins his examination in the history of sexuality by detailing how Greek classical thought, through concepts like chrysis aphrodisian, which roughly translates to the use of pleasures, didn't just passively experience sexual acts, they actively problematized sexual behavior.
Problematized, meaning they made it into a problem to be managed.
Exactly. It became a significant domain of moral valuation and choice, a site for rigorous reflection, ethical work, and the stylization of one's life. It wasn't primarily about a set of universal prohibitions like don't do this, don't do that. It was more a framework for how one managed one's desires, how one used these pleasures within a highly structured moral and social context, particularly for free adult men.
So it sounds like the Greeks were less concerned with what specific acts people did, and maybe more with how they did them, the manner, the self-control involved, and what that said about their character.
Precisely. The ethical structure of the subject in Greek thought, particularly regarding pleasures, was what Foucault terms heudocratic. That's a complex concept combining relationships of domination submission, command obedience, and mastery docility, but directed towards oneself.
So self-governance.
Yes, internal discipline and self-governance were key. Virtue wasn't about complete abstinence from desires that wasn't typically the goal for most citizens, but rather the demonstration of mastery over them. Think of the famous story, which Plato recounts, of Socrates resisting the advances of the beautiful young Alcibiades. For the Greeks reading this, it didn't necessarily prove Socrates was pure or lacked desire, but rather that he possessed the supreme ability to resist, to exert self-mastery even when tempted. That was the ethical achievement.
And this morality wasn't the same for everyone.
No. Definitely not. Sexual morality was often tailored to one's way of life, and crucially, one's social status. Stricter standards of self-mastery and moderation applied to those in the public eye, prominent male citizens who sought to make their lives a kind of brilliant work for others to admire and emulate. A common person, a woman, a slave, their expected conduct and the ethical demands placed upon them regarding sexuality would have been quite different within that discourse.
Okay, and what about marriage in ancient Greece? Was that also viewed through a different discursive lens than our modern conception of, say, a romantic partnership based on love?
Absolutely different, for the most part. Marriage in classical Greece was often primarily seen as a private transaction between families. Its main purpose was ensuring the continued existence of the oikos, the household, the lineage, the property.
So practicality is first.
Very much so. It wasn't primarily envisioned as a romantic union based on love or mutual affection in the way we tend to think of it today, although affection could certainly exist. It was fundamentally about procreation, especially producing legitimate male heirs, managing property, and maintaining the family line and social stability. Consequently, offenses related to women within marriage, particularly adultery by the wife, were frequently framed as violations against the husband's authority, his honor, or his property rights, since legitimate lineage was threatened, rather than primarily as offenses against the woman's body or her individual autonomy itself.
That's a very different framing. Did that change at all?
Foucault does note later shifts, particularly moving into the Hellenistic and Roman periods. He sees evidence of marriage beginning to evolve towards being conceived as a more symmetrical relationship, emphasizing mutual respect, companionship, and sympathy between spouses. It started moving beyond just procreation and household management as its sole justification, hinting at the emerging importance of the interpersonal bond, but still within a very different overall framework than ours.
Okay. And then there's the aspect that often seems most contradictory or difficult for modern readers, the love of boys in ancient Greece.
How did Foucault analyze that within this discourse? It was accepted, yet also seemed subject to intense ethical scrutiny.
Yes, the ancient Greek practice of paiderastia, the relationship between an adult man, the Erastes, and an adolescent boy, the Eromenos, presents a significant historical paradox that beautifully illustrates the nuances of Foucault's Order of Discourse. While it was a socially acknowledged, even somewhat institutionalized practice in many Greek city-states, particularly among the elite, it was also the domain where, Foucault argues, the strictest austerities were often expected and valorized.
Strictest austerities, even though the practice itself was accepted. Precisely. Surprisingly, the ideal of a renunciation, of physical consummation, or at least a severe moderation and focus on the pedagogical and ethical aspects of the relationship, emerged strongly here. Again, Socrates often serves as the paradigm. His relationship with Alcibiades involved deep affection and mentorship, but supposedly an abstention from physical acts. The emphasis was often placed on purifying love, directing it towards the boy's potential virtue, towards being per se in its truth, rather than simple physical gratification for the older man.
So it was a domain of intense moral problematization.
Extremely so. An accepted practice was simultaneously subjected to rigorous ethical demands. The discourse surrounding it wasn't about simple prohibition, don't do it, but about a complex stylization of conduct, requiring the adult man to demonstrate profound self-control, act as a virtuous guide, and focus on the boy's ethical development, not merely indulge his own desire. The potential for shame and dishonor was significant if the relationship was seen as purely exploitative or driven by lust.
Wow. Okay, now, contrast all of that. The focus on self-mastery, the status differences, the specific problematization of boy love, with the Christian morality of sexuality that follows. Foucault argues this marks a dramatic shift, moving the focus from outward conduct and mastery to something much more internal, hidden deep within the person.
It's a profound departure, a fundamental restructuring of the discourse.
Yeah?
Under Christian morality, particularly as it developed through figures like the Church Fathers, the ethical substance, the core material of moral concern, was no longer defined primarily by aphrodisia, the external acts, the pleasures themselves and their management, but by desires that lie hidden among the mysteries of the heart.
So the battleground shifts inward.
Completely. Morality becomes centered on internal thoughts, intentions, spontaneous desires, the slightest stirring of concupiscence. Practices shifted accordingly towards self-renunciation and a purity whose model was increasingly sought in virginity, which was elevated to a superior status. The main ethical work became the elucidation, renunciation, and decipherment purification of these internal desires.
Decipherment purification, like you have to constantly analyze your own thoughts.
Yes. It required a constant self-interrogation, a meticulous mapping of one's inner world to detect and root out any trace of illicit desire, any thought that deviated from prescribed purity. This internal focus created a whole new domain for moral scrutiny and self-examination, which eventually develops into practices like detailed confession.
So it's a move from managing outward conduct to policing inward thoughts and intentions. Was this uniform, though? Did all early Christians agree on, say, the value of celibacy?
Not entirely, and Foucault is good at highlighting these nuances. He points to Clement of Alexandria, an important early Christian thinker, who offered a fascinating counterpoint regarding celibacy. Clement actually argued that choosing celibacy could potentially be impious if it meant refusing to participate in the economy of procreation.
Impious.
Because Clement saw procreation within marriage not just as a human act, but as a necessary collaboration between God and man that contributed to the divine plan of creation, filling the world as God intended. To refuse this collaboration without a higher calling could be seen as neglecting one's duty within God's economy. This shows that even within the broad framework of early Christian discourse on sexuality, there were complex internal debates and evolving understandings about the relative values of marriage, procreation, and celibacy. It wasn't monolithic from day one.
That's a really interesting point. And then later, Augustine comes along and introduces this hugely influential concept of libido into the discourse, which really shaped Christian thought on sex and marriage for centuries. How did his ideas create a new way of understanding the morality of the sexual act, especially within marriage?
Augustine's contribution is absolutely pivotal. He was wrestling with a major theological problem. If marriage was considered good and ordained by God, how could it involve the sexual act, which, after the fall of Adam and Eve, inevitably seemed to entail involuntary and hence shameful movements of concupiscence, that unruly surge of physical desire? If concupiscence was a consequence of original sin, how could a good institution like marriage involve an act tainted by it?
That's a real paradox. How did he resolve it?
His concept of usus, meaning use, allowed for a crucial distinction to be made within the discourse. While the structure of the sexual act itself might inevitably involve concupiscence, that involuntary element that escapes rational control, the consent to the act, the will of the spouses, could be directed towards legitimate ends.
Legitimate ends like
Primarily procreation, seen as the main justification for sex within marriage. Also, rendering the marital debt, fulfilling one's obligation to one's spouse, and even preventing fornication, channeling desire into a legitimate outlet. By directing their will towards these good ends, Augustine argued, the spouses could engage in the act without willing themselves to be purely concupiscent subjects at that moment, even if the involuntary movements of libido were present.
So intention becomes key, even if the physical reality is complicated.
Precisely. It created a complex framework for understanding the morality of sexual relations within marriage, emphasizing intention, consent, and the proper use of sexuality within a system of meticulous internal scrutiny about one's motivations. This Augustinian discourse on libido, concupiscence, and use profoundly influenced Western thought, leading to centuries of detailed moral theology focused on desire, intent, and the regulation of the flesh. The takeaway is how a complex theological framework became such a powerful discursive tool for organizing, categorizing, and judging the most intimate human experiences.
That's a truly detailed and frankly eye-opening example of how something we think of as personal and natural sexuality has been historically problematized and shaped by these shifting discursive orders. Okay, let's pivot now. Moving from the bedroom, as it were, to the asylum and the prison. Foucault reveals how these institutions aren't just places you put people you want out of sight. They are sites where certain types of subjects, the mad, the delinquent, are actively produced through specific discursive orders.
Yes, it's a similar analytical move. It's not just about locking people up. It's about how the very process of confinement and the discourses surrounding it define who those people are understood to be, both by society and eventually, often by themselves.
So how did this work historically, say, before our modern idea of distinct psychiatric hospitals or prisons?
Well, if we look back at the 17th and 18th centuries, institutions like the Hôpital General in France or similar large workhouses and houses of correction in England were massive places of confinement. And they held an incredibly broad range of individuals under one roof, often with little distinction. It wasn't just those we might now label insane. It also included the poor, the unemployed, beggars, vagrants, the debauched, spendthrift fathers, prodigal sons, blasphemers, sometimes petty criminals, people with venereal diseases. A real mix.
All lumped together.
Largely, yes. What's striking, Foucault points out when examining the administrative records and justifications for these places, is that there's often no sign of a differentiation in the fundamental sensibility or the prescribed treatment among these diverse groups. They were all brought together under a broader discourse of confinement.
And what was the logic behind that discourse? Why confine all these different people together?
The prevailing view, the dominant discourse, wasn't primarily medical or even strictly punitive in our sense. It was largely economic and moral. The core problem was identified as idleness. Idleness was seen as the root of all social disorder. Poverty, crime, immorality, even madness was sometimes linked to it. And therefore, the prescribed remedy, the overarching logic of these institutions, was work. Often forced, highly regimented, punitive labor was seen as the cure-all, the way to instill discipline and make these unproductive bodies useful to the state, regardless of the specific reason they were confined.
So madness wasn't necessarily seen as a distinct medical condition needing specific treatment, but more as just one form of social uselessness or deviation, treatable by forced work and discipline.
In many ways, yes, within that particular discursive formation, it was less about individualized pathology and more about integrating or segregating individuals based on their relationship to work and social order. And this undifferentiated approach, this broad discourse of confinement and idleness, really sets the stage for the next major transformation, the birth of the modern prison as we know it.
And Foucault has a unique take on why the prison became the dominant form of punishment, doesn't he? It wasn't just because reformers thought it was better.
No, his argument is quite different. He acknowledges the role of reformers like Beccaria or Bentham, who argued for prisons on grounds of rationality and humaneness compared to, say, torture or execution. But Foucault argues that the universal adoption and persistence of the prison wasn't primarily driven by these legal or philosophical ideals found in codes. Instead, he contends it emerged from the spread of what he calls disciplinary power.
Disciplinary power, we touched on that, the subtle everyday controls.
Exactly. This diffuse set of mechanisms and techniques aimed at normalizing and controlling individuals through observation, detailed routines, timetables, spatial organization, examination, all designed to train bodies and minds. The prison, especially designs like Bentham's Panopticon, even if not always perfectly built, with its potential for constant surveillance and its meticulous regulation of every moment of the inmate's life, didn't just punish past acts. It actively functioned, Foucault argues, to produce a specific type of subject, the delinquent.
Produce the delinquent. How does an institution produce a type of person?
By isolating them, categorizing them, subjecting them to a specific regime of power and knowledge, studying them, and creating a whole narrative around them. The prison system, with its classifications, case files, and focus on the inmate's character and potential for reform or incorrigibility, helps solidify delinquency not just as a series of illegal acts, but as a specific condition, a type of person, a quasi-pathological identity.
And this newly defined delinquent subject then became, almost conveniently, the perfect object for study by emerging scientific fields.
Precisely. This new category of the delinquent was exactly the kind of subject amenable to study by the burgeoning disciplines of medicine, psychology, or criminology in the 19th century. They were observable within the controlled environment of the prison. Their behaviors could be meticulously documented, measured, theorized about. Paradoxically, the prison, this supposedly darkest region of the justice system, hidden away from society, became a fertile field of objectivity for these human sciences.
So the prison generated the data that fueled the sciences that then justified the prison's methods.
It's a kind of feedback loop. The prison provided the subjects and the observations, which allowed these sciences to develop theories about criminal behavior, the criminal mind, or deviance. These scientific findings, framed as objective truth, then often serve to reinforce the prison system itself and the categories it employed. It's a powerful example of how legal discourse, medical discourse, and psychological discourse can coalesce around an institution like the prison to create and define new categories of people, new types of subjects, rather than simply responding neutrally to pre-existing conditions. It shows how subjects are literally formed through discourse, bringing new identities into being that can then be studied, managed, and controlled.
That's incredibly powerful. So it makes you think, doesn't it? Next time you hear people categorized perhaps as mentally ill, criminal, unemployable, it's worth asking, are we relying on unseen orders of discourse to create those distinctions? Are these categories natural, or are they constructed through specific historical processes, institutions, and ways of talking? Are we, for instance, still operating under a kind of discourse of idleness when we judge someone's worth primarily by their economic productivity?
That's exactly the kind of critical questioning Foucault encourages. Because these categories are rarely, if ever, neutral or natural, they are constructed and they have real effects. And this construction extends even into fields we often assume are purely objective, like economics.
Right. Even something as seemingly objective and number-driven as economics has its own hidden rules, its own forms of discourse.
Yeah.
We often think of economic principles, supply and demand, inflation as universal laws, almost like laws of physics. But Foucault shows that they, too, are products of specific historical ways of thinking, specific ways of ordering and valuing the world.
Absolutely. Foucault traces how economic thought itself underwent significant shifts in its underlying discourse. For example, during the mercantilist era, prevalent during the age of absolute monarchies in Europe, economic discourse often focused heavily on money's intrinsic value, the sheer weight and purity of gold and silver bullion. Wealth was primarily understood as the accumulation of these precious metals within a nation's treasury. State policy was geared towards maximizing exports and minimizing imports to hoard gold.
So wealth was basically treasure.
In a significant way, yes. But by the time of the classical age, and especially with thinkers like Adam Smith, the emphasis within economic discourse shifted dramatically. It moved towards understanding money primarily through its exchanging function, its ability to serve as a universal measure of value and a fluid medium for trade, facilitating the circulation of goods and services throughout the economy. Wealth was no longer just about hoarding gold. It became linked to the productivity of labor, the division of labor, and the free flow of trade within a nation and between nations.
A shift from static wealth to dynamic circulation. And this shift in how value is understood also leads to new, sometimes maybe counterintuitive or even pessimistic, economic truths, like those Foucault highlights in the work of David Ricardo. How did Ricardo's theories in particular reveal a new kind of historicity creeping into the discourse of economics?
Yes, Ricardo's analysis, particularly of ground rent, a rent paid for the use of land, was a radical departure from previous economic thought and reveals this emerging historicity. Earlier economists, like the physiocrats, often saw rent as a sign of nature's inherent bounty, a generous gift flowing from fertile land.
The goodness of the earth.
Right. But Ricardo flips this completely. He argues that ground rent is not a sign of nature's fruitfulness, but rather a result of the increasing difficulty of production due to the avarice of the land, meaning its scarcity and varying fertility. As population grows, demand for food increases, forcing farmers to cultivate progressively poorer, less fertile land. This inevitably increases the cost of producing food, since it takes more labor or capital on poorer land. As the price of food rises to cover these higher production costs, landowners who possess the more fertile plots can charge higher and higher rents, essentially capturing the difference in productivity.
So rent comes from scarcity, not abundance.
Exactly, and this inherent pessimism in Ricardo's analysis, the idea that growth faces natural limits, that population pressure on finite resources drives up costs and creates conflict between classes, landowners versus capitalists versus workers, paradoxically gave the products of labor and the economic system itself a new kind of historicity. Economic outcomes weren't just the result of timeless, harmonious laws. They became subject to historical forces and developments. The pressure of population growth, the exhaustion of resources, the struggle over distribution. Economics became entangled with history, with time and circumstance, not just static principles.
Okay, that makes sense. Economics gets grounded in historical processes. And this leads to another fascinating Foucauldian point, the emergence of the concept of homo economicus, the economic man, the rational, self-interested individual, and how that idea actually posed a challenge to traditional political power structures. It sounds like a purely abstract economic concept had very real political implications.
It absolutely did. The concept of homo economicus, the individual understood as being primarily driven by self-interest, making rational calculations to maximize their own utility or profit, represented a profound political challenge to the traditional notions of the sovereign ruler. If individuals were fundamentally motivated by their own economic interests, and if the market, as thinkers like Smith suggested, could largely regulate itself through the invisible hand generated by these self-interested actions, then the idea that economic activity fundamentally eludes the sovereign became increasingly prevalent.
Meaning the king or the state couldn't fully control the economy.
Precisely. It implied that traditional forms of top-down, direct command and control rule were potentially inefficient or even counterproductive when it came to managing a complex modern economy driven by countless individual decisions. This forced a fundamental rethinking of governmental practice itself. This is central to Foucault's study of governmentalization or governmentality. He looks at how political power, faced with this relatively autonomous sphere of the economy and the figure of homo economicus, increasingly aims to model itself on market economy principles.
Governing through the market rather than against it.
In many ways, yes. It becomes less about directly controlling every individual's actions, and more about creating an environment, setting the rules of the game, managing population, using incentives and disincentives within which individuals, by acting rationally in their own perceived self-interest, will collectively produce the outcomes desired by the government, like economic growth, public health, etc. This reveals, for Foucault, that power in modern societies is often not simply in the hands of those who govern in a straightforward, top-down way. Instead, it's exercised through these complex relays and controls, often diffused throughout society, guiding behavior subtly through economic reasoning, expert knowledge, and shaping the very choices individuals perceive as rational or beneficial.
That's a really crucial insight. So when you hear economic truths being used today to justify particular policy decisions, arguments, say, for deregulation because the market knows best, or against certain social safety nets because they might distort incentives, or even how we sometimes think about our own value purely in terms of our productivity or earning potential in the workforce, it's vital to remember Foucault's point. These aren't just neutral, objective facts falling from the sky. They are part of a powerful, historically constructed discourse that shapes our reality, defines what seems rational, and subtly governs us in profound ways.
Exactly. And these powerful shaping discourses extend even to something as seemingly straightforward and fundamental as the idea of an author.
That's a great final example, because the idea of an author is something most of us probably take completely for granted. We assume an author is simply the person who physically wrote a book or an article, a clear, definable individual behind the text. But Foucault complicates this dramatically, showing that the author is also a powerful discursive construct, what he famously called the author function, which has its own rules and performs specific operations within our culture.
This is one of his most subtle, but I think profoundly insightful points explored in his essay, What is an Author? For Foucault, the name of an author is not precisely a proper name among others. It functions differently.
How so? What's the difference between, say, my name and Shakespeare's name?
He illustrates this with a clever thought experiment. If it were discovered tomorrow that, say, a specific historical person named Pierre Dupont, whom we believed had blue eyes, actually had brown eyes, it wouldn't fundamentally change the fact that the name Pierre Dupont still refers to the same distinct individual. It's just a correction of a biographical detail. But Foucault argues, if it were definitively proved that William Shakespeare had not written the sonnets that we currently attribute to him, this would constitute a significant change and affect the manner in which the author's name functions.
Because the name Shakespeare carries more than just biographical identity.
Exactly. It's not just a trivial detail about who held the pen. It fundamentally alters the very function of the author's name in relation to those texts. That name carries a weight, an organizing power that goes far beyond simple identification. It classifies the work, groups it with others, guarantees a certain level of quality or meaning.
So, the author's name isn't just a label stuck on a text. It's more like an organizing principle, a kind of conceptual gravity that pulls together a whole universe of meaning around certain texts and excludes others.
You've put that beautifully. That's precisely the idea of the author function. The author's name acts as a principle of stylistic uniformity. It leads us to look for, and often find, a consistent voice or characteristic approach across diverse works attributed to that name. It functions as a field of conceptual or theoretical coherence. It encourages us to assume that there's a unified philosophical project, a consistent worldview, or an evolving intellectual trajectory behind a writer's entire output. And ultimately, it serves as a powerful principle of unity for a body of work, allowing us to group disparate texts together, sometimes written decades apart, and assume a single, consistent intention or perspective behind them all.
So it smooths over contradictions.
It often does. Foucault points out that modern literary criticism, much like St. Jerome in ancient times, who had the task of verifying the authenticity and authorship of Christian texts for the canon, still uses criteria like perceived quality, coherence of ideas, historical consistency, and stylistic similarity to attribute works to authors, or to explain away inconsistencies within an author's supposed oeuvre, e.g. early work versus mature work. This demonstrates how the author function actively constructs a coherent, authorial subject behind the texts, even if the texts themselves contain significant contradictions, shifts in thought, or were perhaps even produced collaboratively. It neutralizes potential discontinuities by attributing them to the single, evolving consciousness of the author, rather than seeing them perhaps as separate discursive events.
It's almost like the author is a kind of necessary myth we create, to give order and stable meaning to a potentially chaotic collection of texts, to give them a single point of origin and intention we can refer back to. This must have huge implications for how we consume information today, especially online.
It truly does. The author function allows us to speak conveniently of a Shakespearean style or a Platonic idea or a Foucauldian perspective, creating a shorthand that bundles complex and sometimes varied textual evidence under a single unifying name, even if the real-life individuals were far more complex, contradictory, or evolving than the unified author we construct through this function. And critically, as you say, the author function also plays a crucial role in establishing authority, credibility, and legitimacy, which brings us right back to our information-saturated world.
Absolutely. So next time you're consuming information online, maybe reading a news article, a blog post, a scientific study, and you find yourself judging its credibility based on the authority of the source, or the author asking, is this journalist reputable? Is this researcher from a leading university? Is this commentator trustworthy? Foucault would urge us to dig deeper.
Ask different questions.
Exactly. Ask, what discursive rules and institutional practices allow that specific author or that specific publication to be seen as an authority in the first place? What specific training, credentials, institutional affiliations, or mastery of particular forms of language grant them that legitimacy? And, perhaps most importantly, what does that author function enable? What kinds of truths does it make possible to state? What kind of knowledge does it validate and circulate? And conversely, what does it potentially obscure, marginalize, or prevent from being understood by channeling meaning and authority primarily through these sanctioned, recognizable sources?
It's a powerful critical lens to apply, isn't it? Especially in our current environment where expertise is constantly contested and the sheer volume of information, often anonymously or pseudonymously authored, makes judging credibility incredibly difficult. We often fall back on the author function or its institutional proxies without fully examining how it operates.
We really do. It's a shortcut, but one Foucault would want us to question. And this brings us towards wrapping up this deep dive, pulling together the key takeaways from exploring Foucault's challenging ideas.
It's been quite a journey through his thought.
It really has. So what does this all mean for you listening to this? We journeyed through these profound insights from Foucault, seeing how discourse is so much more than just words on a page or sounds in the air. It's woven into the very fabric of what we can know, how we govern ourselves and others, and even who we fundamentally understand ourselves to be. It dictates the often invisible boundaries of our realities, shaping everything from our most intimate desires to our large-scale economic systems and institutions.
We've seen that knowledge isn't some static universal truth waiting to be discovered. Instead, it's actively structured by historically specific orders, evolving dramatically over time. We traced that shift from the Renaissance focus on interpretation based on hidden similitude to the classical age's emphasis on order through identity and difference. And then we saw how in the 19th century, knowledge fractured into specialized disciplines like biology, economics, philology, each developing its own distinct methods, objects, and ways of producing truth.
And crucially, we saw how power isn't just imposed from the top down.
Not at all. It's a ubiquitous, pervasive network, Foucault argues, that shapes and is shaped by these discourses. Power relations influence everything. Our sexual ethics, where our innermost desires become subject to scrutiny and normalization. Our judicial systems, which don't just punish crime but actively produce categories like the delinquent. And even our economic thought, which subtly guides how societies are governed and how we value ourselves and others.
So this deep dive, we hope, serves as more than just a shortcut to being well-informed about Foucault. The whole thing, it helps with that too. More importantly, it aims to equip you with a powerful critical lens to navigate the world differently.
A new way of seeing.
Exactly. Next time you read an article, listen to a debate, engage in a discussion online, or even just reflect on your own deeply held thoughts and beliefs, try asking yourself those Foucauldian questions. What unseen rules might be at play here? What's being said? Sure, but how is it being said? What assumptions are being made? What does this particular way of talking allow to be understood? And what does it perhaps prevent or marginalize? Who benefits from this specific order of discourse?
It really encourages a deeper level of critical thinking, doesn't it? Questioning the assumptions baked into the language we use, considering different viewpoints not just as opinions, but as potentially stemming from different discursive frameworks. This awareness of the order of discourse can be an incredibly useful tool for navigating the sheer information overload of our modern world. It can provide those aha moments, revealing the hidden forces, the invisible structures that often shape our collective realities and our individual experiences. It empowers you in a way to see the matrices we live within.
Beautifully put. And as we wrap up, as always, we want to leave you with a final provocative thought, something to mull over, something Foucault himself might appreciate perhaps as you go about your day.
Okay. Well, consider this tension we've discussed. If the rigorous search for truth, as Foucault suggests through his reading of Nietzsche and certain historical practices like confession, often involves a kind of sacrifice of the self, a potentially painful shedding of prior beliefs, comforts, or even parts of one's identity to confront a difficult reality, and yet simultaneously, much of our modern Western thought, particularly in psychology and self-help culture, constantly aims to establish a positive emergence of the self, to discover or construct an inherent positive, authentic truth about who we are, to affirm our identity.
Two very different impulses.
Very different. So the question is, how do we reconcile these two powerful, seemingly contradictory drives in our contemporary quest for knowledge, both about the world and about ourselves? Is genuine knowledge always costly in some way? Can we have both self-affirmation and radical truth-seeking? And perhaps more speculatively, what new orders of discourse might be subtly emerging right now, maybe through artificial intelligence, new forms of social media, genetic technologies, or climate change narratives quietly shaping what can and cannot be said, thought, or even imagined about our present moment and about the kind of future we are heading towards? What truths are being produced and what sacrifices might they be demanding, perhaps without us fully realizing it yet?
Wow. Okay, that is definitely something to chew on. A perfect Foucauldian cliffhanger. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring.